attendees?
Once we start, then we have not started yet.
Okay.
Namaste and good evening, everyone. I, Ritika Gupta, Assistant Director at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav Vipamniti Anusandhan Sansthan, Nai Delhi, extend my heartiest welcome to you all to this #Web Policy Talk. Today, we are here for a special talk as part of the series, The State of Cities, #City Conversations on Infrastructuring the City, Trajectories of Violence. The speaker for today is Dr. Deljana Iossifova. I would now like to request our moderator, Dr. Arjun Kumar, who is director at IMPRI, to introduce the program and the speaker further. Thank you. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Ritika. And I welcome all of you to our series, The State of Cities, #City Conversations. And we are glad to have this talk today and our distinguished panelists to contribute to our series. And we all can learn from these experiences. So today's lecture, Infrastructuring the City, Trajectory of Violence, is given by Dr. Deljana Iossifova. Ma'am is a senior lecturer in urban studies at the University of Manchester, United Kingdom, where she is also the director of Confucius Institute. Ma'am is also chair of the Urban Studies Foundation, very renowned in urban studies. And currently, Dr. Deljana leads a portfolio of research on sustainable infrastructure and transition. Her work she has worked on complex urban transformation, cities and biodiversity, and the human ecosystem of aging. Her main research focus is on the global East and South, including China, Japan, Bulgaria, India, and Brazil. Ma'am is also author of the Translocal Aging in the Global East and lead editor of Defining the Urban. These are the book by ma'am. We also have a very distinguished panelist today. So to chair the session, we have Professor Darshini Mahadevia, and ma'am is Associate Dean of Arts and also Professor of Social Science at School of Arts and Social Sciences, Ahmedabad University, Ahmedabad, Gujarat. Welcome, ma'am. For discussants, we also have a very renowned and distinguished urban experts. We have Professor Zufair, who is Professor of Sociology and Global Urban Studies at Michigan State University from United States. We have Dr. Rumi Aizaz, who is Senior Fellow and Head of Urban Policy Research Initiative at Observer Research Foundation, URF, New Delhi. We have very senior Professor Sreedhar, ma'am, who is Professor at Center for Research in Urban Affairs at Institute for Social and Economic Change, ISEC, Bangalore, Karnataka. We have Mr. Sameer Unhale, who is a practitioner, who is currently Joint Commissioner at Department of Municipal Administration, Government of Maharashtra. Ambika Vishwanath, ma'am, who is co-founder and director at Kubernetes Initiative, non-resident fellow, Agora Strategy Institute, Germany, and also a China-India visiting fellow at Ashoka University. We are also fortunate to be joined by Ziming. Thank you for joining so late, Ziming, who is an assistant professor and lecturer at Wuhan University, Wuhan, China. And we'll also be joined by Dr. Soumyadeep Chattopadhyay, who is associate professor at Vishwabharati University, Santiniketan, and a visiting senior fellow at IMPRI. So I welcome all of you, and now I invite our chair to give her opening remarks and welcome our speaker for the day. Darshini, ma'am, over to you. Ma'am, you're on mute. Yeah.
So good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are. We still have Professor Shuferen joining, or she's not yet joined?
I will check with her. Yes.
Because I don't see her.
I will check.
Okay. So, we are meeting today to discuss a very, very important aspect of urbanization that we largely see in the cities of Global South, but is very rapid expansion of infrastructure, or what is said infrastructure-led economic growth. I was seeing Dr. Deljana's slide. A lot of her slides are located in the context of China, which has actually seen much rapid. The economic growth is largely based on investments in infrastructure development in the cities, and so both infrastructure development in cities and urbanization have been the drivers of economic growth. And now number of other countries, including what we see in India, following that path. However, the impacts of such massive infrastructure development that we see are not neutral or not equitable. Our own research tells us, and there has been this term which is called in the literature on violence in cities, a term called infrastructural violence. That is violence, experience of violence, is structural violence often on account of the type of infrastructure projects that are taken up. And the selective investments in large capital intensive infrastructure can also lead to deprivations of everyday infrastructure required in people's life, which leads to another set of denials and structural violence. So I invite Dr. Deljana Iossifova to give her presentation on this very interesting and newly emerging area of research in urban studies. Over to you, Dr. Iossifova.
Thank you very much. I will be sharing my slides in just 1 second. Just let me open this up again. There we go. So thank you very, very much for the invitation. And thank you for organizing this wonderful group of discussants and the chair for this session, Dr. Kumar. So I would like to talk about infrastructural violence in possibly slightly different terms than they are being discussed in the literature at the moment largely. I want to talk about how infrastructure shapes everyday lives, how it shapes social relations, how it shapes urban form, and also longer term development trajectories in cities, not only in the global south, but mainly in the global south. I will be focusing here on China, and because findings from India and from Brazil are not as developed, we're just beginning to work in these areas. Infrastructure is the transformative agency, or infrastructuring is the transformative agency of infrastructure. So I want to talk here about how infrastructure has this power to change social relations, to change cities in ways that are largely unpredictable and therefore require very, very diverse sets of inquiries or methods of inquiry. Violence is central to contemporary infrastructuring. I will try to show that in this presentation, and I want to discuss, hopefully with all of you, how to balance between the benefits that infrastructural development can bring and the impact of such development on longer term sustainability, be it social or ecological or economic. A lot of the things that I will be talking about emerge from projects that have been going on since 2019, slightly delayed with the emergence of COVID-19, but also bringing to the fore very, very interesting new questions and findings in relation with pandemics and public health that do emerge from the current situation. We work with colleagues in Mumbai at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. We work with colleagues at Tongji University in Shanghai, with colleagues in Belo Horizonte in Brazil, and we have a team here in the UK that sits in between the Manchester Metropolitan University, University of Aberdeen, and University of Manchester. We also have colleagues situated in Japan at the University of Tokyo who are contributing to this project. Those are just co-investigators across the two different projects that we're currently working on. And then we have a big body of fantastic students and postdoctoral researchers who are contributing to this research as well. So what is infrastructure? And for us, infrastructure is complex formations that include resources, they include technology, they include humans, obviously, and they are entangled in many, many ways with nature, be it through this requirement for resources, for the extraction of resources, as well as for the disposal of waste that emerges from any kind of social activity. I want to talk here about sanitation in particular, because this is where our research focus is on. And what you see here is an old map of Shanghai, showing you Shanghai's canals 100 and something years ago. So what happened, I'm going to start with just showing you a bunch of different types of infrastructural systems and how they influence how we think about infrastructure as such. So here, for instance, we start with this old map of Shanghai with its canal systems. And the way it used to work was that, and it works in very similar ways in many places around the globe, obviously, but people produced human waste in their homes, in the city. They put out big pots full of human waste in front of their doors that was then collected by workers driven to the canals and sold to people on their boats, who then transported human waste to the countryside, where it was processed to become fertilizer and used to fertilize the land, to grow food that was then sold back to the city to feed urban residents. Now, we would think of that as a fairly closed loop system that doesn't produce waste, that values, in fact, waste as something that gives life and provides opportunities to grow food and feed back into the system, if you want. So the system was actually in place for a very long time in many cities in China, and in Shanghai in particular. Its more recent form looks something like this. So this is from the 1960s, recently modernized, but still mainly functioning in very similar ways, where older neighborhoods in Shanghai collect their human waste as part of, or where human waste is collected within such community waste collection stations. So people from their homes bring their night pots and their waste in the mornings to this waste collection station, throw it into this hole in the wall, basically, and then it gets picked up, sucked up by the honeysucker trucks and brought away to be processed. No longer directly to the countryside, but to treatment plants and so on and so on. So still the system has been in place over hundreds of years, continuing to exist within this context. And then, of course, this is what we would think of as service network sanitation. And then, of course, we have modernization, we have the ideas of progress and modernity and what to expect from such progress. And one such thing is the Western style flush toilet. Unfortunately, to date, no one has invented a system that could deal with the mass of human waste produced in mass high-rise accommodations, such as this produced here in Shanghai, as well as all over the world in high-rise buildings, dense human settlements. The flush toilet and the waterborne sanitation system is still being thought of as the most efficient way to get rid of human waste. I will talk later about the implications of such ideas. But what we see is that in the past, dealing with human waste involved a large chain of objects, of people, of activities to deal with human waste, to get rid of human waste, to reuse human waste, while as today it is mostly done through technology that may require some maintenance, but certainly not the massive human agency that it did over the last hundreds and thousands of years. Now, what does infrastructure mean in the everyday? It determines in very, very actively where, when, and how everyday social practices occur. And again, I want to stick here with sanitation, and I want to stick here with Shanghai. What we see here is a situation where the inhabitants of this makeshift line of housing that you see in this picture have no access to within their so-called homes, nor do they have access to human waste collection stations or community waste collection stations, such as the one that I showed you earlier. So in effect, they rely on open defecation in the streets, and they rely on public toilets as and where they are available in the city. Public toilets that I think still continue to close at 9 o'clock at night and open at 5 o'clock in the morning and remain closed during the night. That obviously has implications for when and where and how people go to the toilet. They have to go at specific times of the day. They have to identify places where they can go to be either undisturbed or unseen by others, and so on and so on. That carries risks of exposure. It has its limitations in many, many different ways. It carries risks of violence of all kinds, including sexual violence. And it certainly is not something that we would consider safe in the city. In Shanghai, we've had a whole range of short-term fixes that sought to repair the neglect of withheld or the neglect or the withholding of infrastructure within the city. And there was a huge push for short-term fixes right before the Shanghai Expo and the Beijing Olympics in 2008 and 2010 respectively. So the city installed water taps for families and older type housing that did not have access to tap water in the past. So there were such communal water tap stations to make sure that people were happy just in advance of the Olympics and the Shanghai Expo. There were also grave mistakes made. So all of these things are considered temporary fixes. For instance, in this case here, right, smack in the city center of Shanghai, what you see is a construction site where half of the neighborhood had been demolished to make space for new developments, for new construction, and where unfortunately the waste collection station was demolished as well. And all of a sudden people realized that they have nowhere to get rid of their waste. So what was done was this temporary fix, which is basically a hole in the ground, raised above ground, where people go to do their business. And this was meant to be a temporary fix until the construction site began properly, until the rest of the neighborhood was demolished, and so on and so on. But it remained in place for 8 years as the only solution to the neighborhood's sanitation needs, because of holdups with the construction site, because of the undecisiveness of the local government about what to do about the situation, and so on and so on. But we have here a permanent, if you want, temporarity that exists across different sites in the city, where one step precedes another, but steps are jumped within the system, and so mistakes are made, and temporary fixes need to be developed that may or may not meet actual community needs. With this waste collection or service network sanitation infrastructure, we have the continuous interaction of humans with specific infrastructural objects, such as the infamous Chinese night pot that you can see here in this picture. And you do have an extension of the boundaries of home. You have the everyday passage, if you like, through the city, from the place where you sleep and eat to the place where you get rid of your shit, excuse my language, where you have to walk for several minutes to empty your night pot, to wash your night pot, to carry it back home. that in itself is linked with social interactions of all kinds, with little chats, for instance, but it can also, of course, be linked with risks and potential exposure to violence of all kinds. We see here this moment of a human infrastructure interaction where this lady empties her night pot in one of those waste collection stations because she lives in the older neighborhood on our side of the photograph, if you like. And this waste collection station for this neighborhood is located right next to the entrance to a huge high-rise residential compound built for the urban middle classes. So we have here coexistence of the old and the new, and the networked and the not networked, if you like, and the old style and the new progressive modern sanitation infrastructure. So you have a coexistence, a fragmentation of the city, whereby privacy and privilege is something that is, or privacy is the privilege of the middle class and the upper class, and certainly not something that people in older neighborhoods can expect or rely on. So as I said, we have not only in Shanghai, but across cities in China, across cities in the global south, the coexistence of technical infrastructures. So in this case, again, the service network infrastructure and the waterborne infrastructure for sanitation, which also means the coexistence of different practices, open defecation, handling your night pot, having your flush bowl toilet inside your home. And this coexistence is linked with many, many different processes within society, as well as reflected in urban form. In essence, however, infrastructure structures everyday life, where you go to the loo, whether you lose the bike or whether you use your car or public transportation, whether you have access readily from to electricity from your plug, or whether you have to be inventive to get electricity. All of these things determine how your everyday life is structured, when you do what and how you do it. And then we get to infrastructure environment interactions. And I said it before, the density of these fragmentations, how they relate to each other, all of these things shape urban form, they shape the city. I'm going to give you a very old example, something that I worked on many, many years ago, but here you have it. Urban form reflects the type of infrastructure that services it. So we have here the old neighborhood with its narrow lanes suitable for bicycles and little things, with its non-existent or temporary or service network sanitation infrastructure. We have it right across the street from the high-rise buildings that are serviced by waterborne sanitation, that have the underground parking attached to them, where landscape and green infrastructure is part of the concept of such neighborhoods from the onset, and so on and so on. All of these infrastructures require space, obviously, and all of these infrastructures replace things, places, and people that have been there before. And that in itself embodies violence towards the city, towards the existing social and technical infrastructures, where the implementation of infrastructure, of modern infrastructure, of modernization takes place. Infrastructuring shapes the conditions of social life, and I'm going to give you just a few examples of how, again, sanitation does that in the case of some of the people that we've spoken to in Shanghai. We have here the example of a self-built little house that was in possession of the family for 50 years plus. The parents died, the two brothers broke into a huge fight about who's going to inherit the house because of new inheritance laws and so on and so on. Eventually they divided the house in two. They ended up with one brother having access to a tap inside their home and the other brother not, and those two brothers have not spoken to each other for the last 7 years because they simply cannot come to terms as to how to divide the house properly and how to make sure that both of them have access to the tap water. Just a small example. We have the situation where older people are used, have grown up with, have lived all their life with night pots and having to rely on communal waste collection stations where they now are isolated from younger generations within their own family because younger generations do not wish to come and visit under such conditions anymore. After 2 hours or so, everyone will have to go to the toilet, and they simply cannot even imagine using a night pot or going to the public toilet within such older neighborhoods. So in this case, those grandparents told us the children and grandchildren call, but they no longer come to visit because they simply cannot come to terms with the type of infrastructure available in such areas. Another couple who lives with their 30-plus-something-year-old son, where the situation is slightly different, where the son cannot get married, and I've heard lots of examples like that from India as well, and they cannot get married because every time he brings back a girlfriend to their home and the girlfriend realizes that a flush toilet is not available, she runs away and no longer wants to be in this relationship. So this requirement for the flush toilet, the Western style toilet as a requirement or pre-requirement for marriage. And then, of course, we have the situation where people who do not have access to any kind of sanitation are stigmatized and made responsible for the decline in the urban environment because they're seen as dirtifying it, because they have to defecate in the open, because they have to hide behind cars, behind trees to do their business, and simply because there are no other options available. So we have here a situation where the failure to provide infrastructure leads to stigma, leads to exclusion from elementary social processes. And here we are with violence. Or back to violence, or starting with violence. And there is a distinction between the direct violence, where resources are actively destroyed, and the structural violence that Galton has spoken about in terms of social injustice, where resources are monopolized by a group or class or are used for other purposes. And we have all of this occurring when it comes to infrastructuring. Infrastructural violence is appearing in multiple modes, and it's appearing now, and it has implications for generations, or for social groups now, as well as for future generations because of the trajectories that it carries. So this infrastructuring violence includes the withholding, as well as the implementing, as well as the maintenance of infrastructure. And I'm almost running out of time, so I'm going to make this real quick, but we do have here, and this is where my interest in infrastructure started, with this photograph here, where you have the young man on the right-hand side standing in front of the gate to his gated compound with his golf swings, waiting to be picked up by his friend to go and play a game of golf and practicing his golf swing. And where you see the little red circle, you have a grandmother holding her granddaughter to pee or do a poo, whatever she is doing, simply because there is no sanitation infrastructure available to her where they live. They live across the street in an older neighborhood without access to sanitation. And this picture made me very, very curious as to how how this is possible in a place that apparently has seen this enormous economic growth. And in fact, figures from a few years back showed that whilst China's growth jumped multifold over the past 2 decades or so, so did also the number of people, or the percentage of people in the city who had to defecate in the open, I think from 3% to 6% in the space of 20 years. So we have here the violence that occurs when you withhold infrastructure, where you simply take infrastructure away and do not provide replacement, such as in the case of this older neighborhood that was slated for redevelopment, where electricity was stopped, where water was stopped, where the waste collection station was no longer emptied and people were forced to sign resettlement contracts, whilst all of their neighbors' houses were demolished to make space for the new construction site. We have the violence of demolishing existing infrastructure, housing, electricity, again, sanitation, demolishing it overnight in order to implement new infrastructure. In this case, people were promised that the older neighborhood would be demolished to make space for a new communal park. Instead, they received a sort of new communal park, but with 3 power substations integrated within it. People were furious. They were worried about their health, the impact on their property prices. They went very, very bravely. It was a different time. This was shortly before the Beijing Olympics. They went on the street. They blocked a major artery for an entire 45 minutes, I think, in protest against the construction of this electricity power substations within their immediate neighborhood. Of course, this was broken down. Of course, the protest was immediately, well, dispelled. It's a long story. I don't have the time to tell you all about it, but of course, it resulted in eventually the power substations being built, displacing the communities that lived there before, displacing the ecological systems that were in place before and replacing them with new infrastructure. It then turned out that this power substation was to feed a new metro station that was built again right next to it a couple of years later. And that takes me to sustainable development, the sustainable development goals, and how this implementation and the construction and development of infrastructure may or may not contribute to sustainable development in the longer term. In China, we have, very similar to what is happening in India, the toilet revolution that was announced by President Xi Jinping in 2015. It targeted mainly the Chinese countryside, but it had enormous effects on urban sanitation infrastructure as well. So public toilets were replaced quickly, they were modernized. We are now in a situation where if you visit a public toilet in Shanghai, more likely than not, you will be met by a face screen software toilet paper dispensing machine that only gives you 60 centimeters of toilet paper. And then you have to wait 9 minutes before you can show your face again and get another 60 centimeters of toilet paper. Supposedly this was designed to prevent stealing toilet paper, but also in terms of sustainability to prevent people from overusing toilet paper. The toilet revolution has also led to an enormous boom in the replacement of existing infrastructural objects. So people went all crazy about the Japanese style toilet seat that sings your song when you sit on it and keeps your bottom warm, and so on and so on. And again, the Western style toilet as a symbol of progress and modernization, all of a sudden becoming the object of desire and being installed in every home, regardless of whether or not this toilet is actually linked with the municipal sewage system or not. In many cases, it is not, and everything that goes into this toilet is flushed into the streets without proper treatment, without proper collection. this is true for, I don't have an official percentage, but an estimated 60 to 80% of municipal sewage anyways. Everything collected by the municipal sewage is flooded into open water bodies, into rivers, into seas, polluting water bodies, polluting the environment, destroying ecosystems, disturbing ecosystems, taking it out of equilibrium, and so on, and so on. And so there's this question of future violence and the maintenance of this enormous progressive infrastructural systems, where we have the question of whether we serve or whether we reduce the violence inflicted on marginalized social groups today, such as women, such as rural to urban migrants, such as the urban poor, in the infrastructural violence that comes from, or that comes with withholding infrastructure from them, whether we want to reduce that in providing infrastructure that in the long term needs the kind of maintenance and massive infrastructural project that leads to the depletion of resources in the long term, that is not sustainable in the long term, because we know that water tables are going down. We know that these levels of water extraction cannot be sustained in the long term, cannot be maintained in the long term, and therefore will lead to the type of violence when it comes to longer term health prospects and well-being prospects for future generations. So at a much, much larger scale, not just the urban poor, but really every single one of us and every single one of our children who will have to suffer from the effects of climate change that come with the depletion of resources and the scarcity of resources as we are progressing with it at this moment. So in short, the infrastructuring inflicts violence through various modes, and this is withholding infrastructure for marginalized social groups and areas, constructing infrastructure in the city, intervening, demolishing, displacing, replacing, and then, of course, maintaining unsustainable infrastructure and depleting resources in the long term. And I think I have more questions than I have answers to anything. Those are just a few of the things that we're working on at the moment and that will be out shortly in publication. And thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Deljana. One is really surprised looking at the discussion that you put forth about the situation in China, because there has been, in terms of overall statistics, the picture looks much better. But in some of the older parts or maybe small towns and cities, you do see still lags in basics infrastructure, such as sanitation. So yes, indeed, it's a different lens to look at what you have looked at. I'm sure the panelists are going to have different views on this, but I am, before I think the panelists come in, I'm not going to summarize or reflect on what you have said, because this is an area that we've also worked and we've also constructed. I think, you know, Amita is part of it, so she was part of the other research team that we were, and there also we have sort of divided or classified violence as structural violence, but structural violence in a more broader sense of systemic deprivation and exclusions, but also everyday violence experienced because of this deprivation, and where the violence experience is different levels. It's different. It's by social groups and gender, because each one of them experience this structural violence very differently, and that needs to be sort of mapped out ethnographically and going into details. And I presume China also has the social differentiation, although, I mean, its Gini coefficient is very high. So obviously there's going to be much larger differentiation in terms of access, deprivation, and structural violence. Especially, I think one knows about city migrants versus migrants versus the resident population. And in the migrants also you have the two categories, one who are more floating population and other is those who are tied to the hukou and so on. So it will be interesting to, in case you have done that work, or probably if you're going to, it seems you're going to embark on this research, so maybe it'd be good to look at that. But something more puzzling to me, and I've not got an answer, so I'm not expecting you to answer, but to brainstorm, because sometimes it's this era of neoliberalism that we're using the term infrastructure that comes with a connotation of economic growth tied to it. But earlier we were using the term services, basic services, water, sanitation. And so at some point in time, I mean, even some of the panelists could reflect on that, of why this shift and why, because I think sanitation, water supply, I mean, in an economic sense, it adds to productivity, but it's also a service. It makes habitable, and it's what I think SDGs are hinting at, that everything that you do finally needs to fulfill the 17 SDGs, which are in any way have overlaps with each other and so on. So why we're using the term infrastructure? So I think these are two things that hopefully a research project seems to future answer, and if somebody wants to sort of reflect on these terms. So maybe now we could invite the panelists to give their inputs. And
Right.
So I don't have any special preference, but I'm looking at your poster. So after Deljana, I mean, it's my name, then Deljana. And so I go to Kala.
Yes.
And I go in that sequence as it is on the poster.
Yes.
So, and it's got how much time, Dr. Arjun Kumar?
Ma'am, Kala ma'am has worked extensively on India-China. I think.
No, I know her. We were part of the same book. But,
around 5 to 7 minutes, ma'am.
Yeah, okay. So Kala has said we have this Elephants and Dragons book.
Yeah, but I won't be talking about that because that's all about economics and benefits and costs of urbanization, agglomeration, benefits of density, and so forth. So I'm not going to talk about that here.
Housing infrastructure, so I did.
Yeah. Okay, good. So thank you very much for this opportunity to listen to this presentation by Dr. Deljana Iossifova, and thank you, Darshini, for this opportunity to go the first. So I can say a few new things, I guess. And Darshini is very right. She was talking about infrastructure and economic growth, the relationship between infrastructure and economic growth. So I was thinking, I mean, when I saw the definition with the title of your presentation, that infrastructural violence is something that I've actually not heard much about. And it's a very, very new and emerging area of research. So I was trying to just clarify in my own mind, what is the difference between infrastructure, period, and infrastructural violence. Infrastructure is, I mean, like Dr. Darshini was saying, that it's basically improves your quality of living, basic service, and so forth, and it contributes to economic growth, improves your quality of living, definitely increases productivity, and so forth. But infrastructural violence actually is a very appropriate term, especially in the context of developing countries, because it shows infrastructure can be used as a double-edged sword, right? So it can be an active infrastructural violence or passive infrastructural violence. And because the term violence is used, I try to use this kind of negatively, right? That is what happens when a certain infrastructure or basic service like sanitation is not provided, right? And actually, Dr. Deljana made a very interesting relationship. I mean, comment about the relationship between infrastructure and urban form. Actually, I think that is not directly related to sanitation, but there is one way in which this actually manifests in a very important manner in India and affects inclusion negatively. And this is, the building area, I refer to the building area regulations called the floor area ratio. That is a very important measure of how tall a building can go, subject to infrastructure availability, road width, setbacks, the parking availability, and other requirements, land use, plot size, and so forth. Okay. So now this directly affects urban form. This directly affects urban form in the sense that cities that have a very high number on this FAR or FSI, as it's called in Gujarat and Maharashtra, they become very tall and very compact and economically efficient. But cities that have a very low number, like Indian cities are very typically representative of this trend, very low FAR, FSI, they are quite spread out, and urban sprawl is easily observed, and long commute times, and housing becomes very expensive because you're bidding up the price of housing and land in general. So that, I thought, is one example in which infrastructure affects urban form. Although, I mean, I do understand that you talked entirely about sanitation. So now, what I wanted to just distinguish here before I go to some constructive comments to Dr. Deljana is that I perceive active infrastructural violence as the policy action when a group is deliberately prevented from accessing a certain service, right? See, actually, I'm sure that, I mean, I was quite shocked to know from the fascinating pictures and images that you showed, Dr. Deljana, that even Shanghai continues to have this problem of open defecation. See, I think similarly, I mean, if a group, an urban slum, a squatter settlement is not provided a water connection, so they will be forced to, defecate in the open probably, right? So these are examples of active infrastructural violence, whereas the FAR, FSI example that I gave, in which cities become compact or sprawl, as the case may be, they are examples of passive infrastructural violence. Cities necessarily don't want to keep the FAR or FSI low, but they want to keep it low because they cannot provide the infrastructure, because you cannot pump up water to the 25th floor, or cannot provide electricity to the 30th floor, right? So that I would call as an example of passive infrastructural violence. So I want to give you some food for thought with the huge amount of data you seem to have on sanitation in Shanghai, and maybe you will be scaling it across nationally also. I would like to really know, I am an urban economist, and see, in India, uh, estimates are that the effect of poor sanitation on the urban GDP is up to 6% of the urban GDP. Those are the estimates, 6%, right? That's quite a lot. 6%, because if you defecate the open, the family will get sick and they will have cholera, they'll have diarrhea, and they go to the doctor, they spend a lot, and all these are accounted for in the GDP. right? So I would like to know, Dr. Deljana, at some point, I mean, just like Professor Darshini said, I don't expect you to answer these questions now, but there's something for you to consider in the next leg phase of your research. So one is the effect of urban sanitation on urban GDP, one. And see, yeah,
Could
I
you,
have a couple more minutes.
I think your time is long overrun. So,
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. So let me just stop at this point because I think Dr. Arjun Kumar said that we'll have some more rounds to come back.
sure.
So thanks a lot, Dr. Deljana. I really enjoyed your presentation with the beautiful stories and the images. And thanks, Professor Darshini, for the opportunity. And sorry if I have overrun my time. Bye for now.
Ma'am,
No,
I have
thanks,
noted.
Anna. Yeah. So can we go to Dr. Rumi Ajaz?
Hello, everyone. Good evening. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So this, first of all, I would like to congratulate the speaker for a very good presentation. The analysis of topics such as plight of some communities, the human and infrastructure interactions, and the social, economic, and environmental impacts of infrastructuring attempted by the speaker is leading to some very useful results.
Rumi, sir, a bit louder, please. Or you can put the mic near you.
Mic closer?
Yeah, mic little closer. Yes, that will.
Is it better now?
Much better. Thank you, sir.
Okay. So as I was saying, I would like to congratulate the speaker for a very good presentation. The analysis of topics such as plight of some communities in China in the context of sanitation, the human and infrastructure interactions that take place, and the social, economic, and environmental impacts of infrastructuring attempted by the speaker is leading to some very useful results. When we study such topics in the context of India, we find many similarities. I myself have looked at some related topics which might be of interest to Dr. Deljana, such as the conditions prevailing in the informal areas of the city. And by informal areas, I mean the slums that are quite a prominent phenomenon in India. Then we have looked at the social and social protests and conflicts over water. There are several communities in cities that are not being provided with a piped supply of water. So many a times they protest, and in the wake of that, there is a lot of violence that occurs between the authorities and the communities that are not getting the service. Then also the practices of manual scavenging and manual cleaning of sewers by the sanitation workers is a prominent phenomenon in India, and it is causing hardships in the lives of those communities, despite the fact that the authorities and the government of India and the state governments, they, while they do have an aim and intention to address the concerns of these sections of the society, but for a variety of reasons, such issues have been long pending in India, about which some urgency or urgent action is required. Then we have also looked at the relocation of poor people to city peripheries. The speaker did mention about this subject in the presentation. I personally have visited Ahmedabad in this context, where slum communities from the Sabarmati River Basin area, river front area, were relocated to the peripheral areas of the city, which did not have sufficient facilities and services for them. That led to a lot of difficulties in the lives of those communities because they were disconnected from their roots. Many children had grown and had lived, and many adults, they had spent their entire lives along the course of the river, but their relocation led to numerous difficulties in terms of their employment, the education of their children, or even commuting, because those far-off areas were not very well connected with the city center where they had been offering services of various kinds and were earning a living there. Then also, then there are the adverse effects of urbanization on water bodies and on the peri-urban areas of cities. I have very carefully tried to understand this in the context of Delhi, where the river Yamuna receives a lot of industrial effluents, and there are many communities who live along the course of the river, which have numerous implications on their health of the communities that live there, and also the peri-urban areas outside or nearby Delhi, or on the peripheries of Delhi. They are subjected to a number of adversities because of the occurrence of urbanization in Delhi. So, and in the satellite towns of Delhi, nearby cities of Delhi. So our understanding of urbanization and infrastructure is being developed or is being understood from a review of the prevailing conditions that we have looked at in India. Although I have been to China a couple of times, and some of the previous speakers, including the Honorable Chair, mentioned that the situation is quite different from what were shown in the slides by Dr. Deljana and what we saw in China when we were there on several occasions about such glaring inequalities that exist insofar as the access to infrastructure and basic services is concerned. I myself, I have a background in urban planning and I've studied urban governance for some time. And in my view, I feel that the equity and inclusion components in city laws, in urban plans, in the governance and development practices that city governments follow, these need to be critically reviewed and analyzed. I do not know how much of this has been attempted by the speaker, Dr. Deljana, today, but we always look at the efforts or attempts being made by the respective governments, whether in India or China, as to what is the approach towards these communities and what are the challenges that they are experiencing in terms of addressing the issues faced by some communities, whether they are in the planned areas of the city or the unplanned area of the city. So my final point is about the attempts that are being made in India, which might be of interest to Dr. Deljana as she pursues her research further. There are a couple of initiatives or missions that the government of India has initiated to address such aspects, and it does to a great extent address the challenges posed by the speaker about the interactions, about the conflicts, about the violence that occurs due to non-availability, due to the relocation of housing from one part to the peripheries of the city. Missions such as the Smart Cities mission, which is for 100 cities of India, and another mission called the Swachh Bharat mission or the sanitation mission, which is being pursued by the Indian government since the present political party came into power, about which has two focus areas. One about just finishing about the provision of toilets at the household level, and also the collection and recycling of solid waste on a big scale, which the citizens are expecting to happen and then the Housing for All mission, and also the National Urban Digital Mission, which is a very recent initiative under which data on a large urban indicators is going to be collected on all urban, about 4,000 statutory towns of the country, on the different urban indicators, including sanitation, and also the capacity building that is going to assist the functionaries in better performance of their tasks. So this aspect or this topic in the context of India is not going to be an easy journey, but I think by reviewing some of the ongoing initiatives would help in finding a way for resolving the current issues. Thank you very much.
So now can I invite Dr. Ambika Vishwanath to present her views?
Thank you, Professor Darshini. And hi, Professor Deljana, again, it's nice to see you again. You know, I have many more questions than comments, I think, but I'm hoping some of my questions will help in furthering your research. But first, I want to actually take off from where Professor Kala and Dr. Rumi sort of led us down this path. As you know, but some of the others here might not know, I work a lot on water, so urban spaces and water security. So in that sense, I'm also veering in that direction a little bit, but it ties really well in with your whole research on sanitation, because, you know, obviously one can't do one without the other. It was very interesting, I think, that Dr. Rumi brought up the whole the missions that we're discussing in India, especially the one on sanitation and our smart cities. And they are worth looking into for some of the ideas they present, but also I would say for some of the things that, some of the learnings of what went wrong that are now trying to be corrected going forward. And one thing that I wanted to point out is I'm doing some research, as you know, on China and the cities there, as well as some of the other cities in Asia on this subject. And this point of passive infra violence that Professor Kala brought out, I think is very important, especially in the Indian context. And I want to give an example over here of where I think it might fit, that then might help you look at some of these cities in China. And then maybe once you broaden your research, is bridging that gap between sanitation and the lack of water. So we had this drive in India to bring, you know, the toilets to every household. But when we started this initiative, we didn't really think about, okay, we'll build this toilet in somebody's house, but if they don't have a water connection, they're not really going to be able to use that toilet, which you mentioned also in some of the older households about the ambition and the aspiration of having this Western, or in India, we have, you know, the Indian style toilets also, but without the water, they're just flushing everything onto the street outside, right? So that connection is now somewhat happening. I would say very little in India, but it's happening. And I think if we look at that from a passive infra-violence lens, which is very, I would say, interesting. I've never thought of that. So thank you, Professor Kala, for actually putting that out there, because I'm going to now, I feel like, redo all of my research from that lens. But I feel like if we look at it from that lens, then it might lead us to a whole host of different, you know, first research and data sets and points, but then possibly lead us to a whole host of different solutions that one might not have already come across. So I wanted to put that out there. And the other, so then now coming to my million questions, I'll try to keep it short and maybe just ask a couple, because then we can come back and maybe some others will have some similar questions. But I was actually a little bit curious because you talked about the social stigma and the violence and gender. And I'm wondering, in some of these cities that you looked at in the research, what happens to the women, especially the women and girls who are at a menstruating period and that age bracket? When they use the toilets, what happens to the products that they're using? Because are they also going in the buckets? Are they going in, is there a separate system for that? Because if there's no separate system, or they're all lumped together, that's a whole different environmental and ecological issue than we're facing. Then, because you talked about how some of these buckets are just being put into the water system, so are all of those products also going in the water system? Because then, as somebody who works on water resources, I'm like, that's you know, that's sort of it's upsetting. So I'm just curious. I mean, is that something you've looked at? Maybe you want to look at, maybe consider what parallel line then can be thought of from that perspective. And then also then to add on over there from the gender angle is, do the young girls then face a similar social stigma? Because there is a definite social stigma in India and in other countries as well, for young girls who are at a menstruating age. So does that stigma exist as well in China? And then how does this whole concept of infrastructure violence, how does it affect them? Is it greater than it affects, for example, I mean, obviously it's greater than it affects a young boy, but what is the extent? What are what is the research behind that? What are the potential solutions, if any, and how do we take that forward then? And I guess my other point is, when we talk about we've talked about the social divide, and there's a systemic deprivation, but I'm also curious, is there a class? I mean, there is a class divide, because we talked about the people who live in the slums and the low income areas, the migrant laborers, but definitely in Indian cities, we see even affluent societies in some of India's cities. I'm in Mumbai, so I'll speak about here. They don't always have access to 24/7 water. Currently, no Indian city gives 24/7 water to all its residents, and some of the richest housing societies I know here in Bombay do not. They buy water from the tankers. They still don't have water all the time. So does that also come into play when we think about infrastructure violence? Or does it not? Is it not big enough of a data set to warrant looking into? I mean, that I'm just curious as to how that plays out in China. I think I've asked more questions than I've commented, but thank you. The presentation was really interesting, and it really helps sort of put some different lenses into some of the work that we're doing here in India. So thank you for that. And Professor Darshini, I will stop now.
Thank you, Dr. Ambika Vishwanath. Our last panelist, I suppose, Dr. Arjun Kumar,
Yes,
Dr. Ziming Lee.
Yes, ma'am. Samir sir is also joining.
Who is joining?
Samir sir. I will coordinate, but Ziming, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah. We are very keen to listen to you. Dr. Lee.
Okay.
Yes, Ziming, we can hear you. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. And I learned a lot from all of you. And because I also do the research about Indian slum upgrading, and especially look at the similar topic, it's about violence happened in Bihar. And I found a lot of similarities between my research and today's presentation. And you define it as infrastructural violence. And I find the reason of the violence happened there is because their perceived infrastructure insufficiency. So it's a kind of a linkage between the insufficiency and the violence because of the scarcity of the resources and the space, and people have to fight to each other. This is my understanding. And when I came back to China, I never realized that in Shanghai, and we also have the similar situation there. It's ignored the corner of the city, and then I find that recently the Chinese scholars, they are focusing on amenity, because amenity is looking at the advanced aspects of infrastructure. And sometimes we look at the more macro level infrastructure provision and usage, and how we can upgrade the infrastructures to make it more attractive and make people feel happy and get more benefits from some advanced infrastructure. And then this is the future directions of the urban renewal, and it's a part of the informal settlement upgrading, and also the other formal residential buildings upgrading. This is what happened in China. And then if I will do the research both in China and India, I would like to see the trend, whether they also put the infrastructure upgrading to that direction. So the linkage between the amenities and infrastructures and people's feelings and their behaviors. But I'm really interested in your one slide. You draw the graph. I think it's a link between the dog, that slide, the dog, and the people within the buildings. And I'm not sure what you are talking about, but I think it's a lot of story happened there, and you visualize the relations between people and the space, and also people and animals. And sometimes we think this is it's kind of hard to just visualize the relations in that way, in a two-dimensional way. But if in the future you can draw a graph in a three-dimensional way, then this is they have more stories to tell. Yeah, this is my comments. Thank you.
Oh, Dr. Lee, thank you for questioning what Dr. Deljana has presented. Dr. Arjun,
Ma'am, we can go to our speaker to respond.
okay, fine.
I will try to collect all the questions until then.
Okay, and I think so. Mr. Samir Unhale is not joining.
I will just check with him.
Okay, so meanwhile, yes. In case he joins,
I will inform.
Yes. Yeah, Dr. Deljana, would you want to respond to some of the comments?
That was a lot, so thank you very, very, very much. I've tried to keep notes, but obviously I will not be able to respond to all of it. But thank you very much, very insightful, very helpful, very inspirational indeed. Let me start with the easy bits, if I have a little bit of time. So Ambika, a question about menstrual waste, menstrual products, and all these kind of things. So the situation in Let me start the other way around. So the project does start with everyday practices. So it is an ethnography in essence. We are not, due to COVID and many other reasons, we're not going into the household surveys and the large scale research that we had planned. So we're going into we're going in from a very, very ethnographic perspective and using very ethnography focused methods of data collection and of analysis. So we have lots of stories of everyday practice and detailed diaries of everyday practice. And this includes menstrual hygiene across different age groups, across different social class, etc., etc. And it is interesting. Menstrual waste usually does not end up in the system because China has always had the basket culture where toilet paper and any kind of paper used for hygiene goes into the basket in the first place. That's the case at home. It's the case in public toilets, any kind of public facilities. And the same is true for menstrual waste. So everything that is sanitary napkins, et cetera, is thrown into baskets that are then being collected as waste rather than being thrown into the toilet. This has to do with the fact that, and I don't remember the precise percentage, but something like 80% of toilet paper is actually produced, is actually not flushable. So toilet paper is simply not thrown into the system. This is beginning to change now with students, workers, etc., who've gotten used to practices abroad, coming back to China and starting to throw paper into the system, and yeah, negative impacts of these kind of exposure to Western practices. So that is beginning to change, but until very, very recently, this simply didn't exist as a thought process to throw your waste into the toilet or into the system. It is, and again, this is also beginning to change. So everything is in the process of changing at the moment. But and my interpretation is that it has a lot to do, that current practices have a lot to do with the history of China and things like the Cultural Revolution, the lack of privacy over many, many, many years, the very dense living conditions that people of all classes have been exposed to over generations. And so this taboo of the toilet or of sanitation or of menstruation or any of these things simply doesn't seem to exist. So people are extremely open to talk about, at least in my experience, they have always been extremely open to talk about their sanitation practices, girls about their menstruation practices. And so this kind of stigma that we know from elsewhere simply does not seem to be a factor of this kind. It is so stigma or the violence against young girls, against women who are menstruating, is not in any way comparable to what we know about from places like India, Thailand, and so on and so on. What we're seeing, however, is, and I guess that's something that we'll be seeing everywhere, is simply the implications for health and well-being, for instance, of pregnant women who do not have access to sanitation, of course, right? So pregnant women who have to go to the toilet in the middle of the night, who do not have the appropriate conditions to bathe or to shower or to take care of their bodies when they need to, and particularly during pregnancy, that being something very, very difficult to deal with. In terms of sanitation practices itself, the class divide is obviously existent. So any kind of sanitation practice variety is associated with a specific social class. And that is very, very clear and leads to very difficult, what do we want to call them, intergroup relations when it comes to inclusion. There was so much that I could talk about, but I think it's really, as an architect, I was trained as an architect, so I come into this as somebody who actually is a big fan of cities, building cities, and high densities and FARs and all these kind of things. I think that we have lots to consider and to reinvent for cities. We are simply assuming and we're appropriating models that have been propagated for whatever reasons by the West and that are not appropriate in any way elsewhere. They're not appropriate for the climate of India, for instance. They're not appropriate for living traditions, practices, habits, etc. in China. So architecture needs to obviously, and city planning and urban planning needs to respond to local conditions of all kinds. And I think we have to learn a lot in that respect. I am still very curious about the economically efficient city of the high FAR. Obviously, it is economically efficient, but how is there a way to make it ecologically efficient as well? And I know that there's a huge debate at the moment, but I think it requires this collaboration between the social scientists and the ecologists and the economists. And well, they are social scientists, but we are not having these conversations, and the planners, we're not having these conversations nearly enough in order to be able to develop appropriate responses for the huge challenges that we are facing in any kind of development strategies and trajectories, particularly in the global south, where things are happening so fast and so not sufficiently thought through at the moment, with impending climate crisis and these very different kinds of challenges that we are facing. So I think we do need to have very, very extended conversations about very basic rules of urban planning and of architecture before we can respond to any of these challenges in the right way. I'm looking at my long list and I'm seeing a long list of things that I could talk about.
Yes, Dr. Arjun Kumar.
Ma'am, I was thinking, meanwhile, I can add some of the questions which have come, but ma'am, if you have list, then please go on.
No, so
yes,
we'll listen to the question. You can raise them with Dr. Deljana, and then we can have a last round of very quick comments from the panelists.
All the panelists, right, ma'am. So one question Ramakrishna has raised, that in India, manual waste collection by the scavengers have been banned, and here it's not waste, it's actually, shit. So is there any such legislation in China that formally bars such practices or inhuman practices? Then we have one question that the term violence implies some sort of domination and submission. Of course, the submission is from the vulnerable. Where is the resolution? Then another question is, increasing pace of urbanization itself imposes a lot of violence on the population, including the environment. In the name of development, the natural resources base is being compromised. Do you think this is a correct understanding of one form of infrastructural violence? And some of the things I have also noted. Dr. Rumi sir also added the schemes which our government have. We also have Amrut, and around 500 cities. There, our focus is on sanitation and infrastructure. We also have community sanitary complexes, and in urban India, during this campaign, we have made 600,000 of those. But again, water and other issues also comes. And what I have been also understanding, and I have worked with Professor Mitab Kundu, and one thing he has been highlighting, that there is exclusionary urbanization, and there is also elite capture. And what we have also witnessed, that our cities, or how we are also giving the services, there has been a very open, our approach has been toward the private sector. That is also not happening. But there is also that the engineering department is taking, or the contractual or quick fix, as you were rightly mentioning at the start. So what do you think would be a sustainable solution towards that? Because everywhere we are having quick fixes for this event or other, or a real estate development by this lever or that. And now we are again, as infrastructure, all the countries are revisiting. Even US, in United States, $2 trillion kind of investment. In India also, we have national infrastructure pipeline. So almost $2 trillion investment there also coming. So what are your recommendations so that we do not go to these quick fixes and make some positive impact? These were some of the questions. Please choose to answer. Then we go a way forward round to everyone. And final comments by UN Chair.
What an easy question, Arjun. Yes. What are the solutions? I'm sorry, unfortunately, I absolutely don't have any kind of recommendations for possible solutions. I just feel that quick fixes obviously are quick fixes and they're not doing the right thing. So what we do need to do is to consider situations on a case-by-case basis and to really begin to reinvent, but based on knowledge, because as far as I'm aware, there's very little work being undertaken that really considers everyday local practices, everyday, really the everyday and how a possible solution to a possible challenge could fit into this everyday without without destroying and disturbing existing social and ecological systems. And that requires lots of work, it requires lots of investment, and I don't think that technical investment is the right way to go as the first go-to solution. So it would require very in-depth, very thorough research into local conditions first in order to identify possible solutions, and that requires again transdisciplinary working. So it requires input from ecologists, it requires input from architects, it requires input from local communities. So you do need that transdisciplinary working in order to develop appropriate solutions.
Right.
So urbanization it's absolutely, and I thought that was an interesting question, but in the name of development, the natural resource base is being compromised. That is absolutely the case. And yes, in my view, this is infrastructural violence, and it is not, again, it's not being taken into consideration enough by those who are planning and implementing potential solutions. And that comes back to that other question about violence, about submission, about the vulnerable. Who are the vulnerable, and who are those enacting the violence? And I think that is a huge problem with the current conception of violence, because it does, especially when we talk about structural violence, it is being assumed that that is not something that can be traced to specific actors. It is considered to be part of the power dynamics within a system, part of the system itself. And I think here I would beg to disagree. I do think that, especially when it comes to infrastructure and the implementation of infrastructure, you can actually trace back. You can count, or you can hold people accountable, actors who are enacting, who are implementing, who are paying for infrastructure, who are taking up loans to implement infrastructure and to withhold it from specific groups. So all of this doesn't happen because of random conditions in the system. It happens because it is being enacted by people in positions of power. So you can hold people accountable, and structural violence is not just simply distributed in random, untraceable ways in the system.
Right.
So I do think that that notion of infrastructural violence requires a lot more work, and I do think that it requires a lot more integration in the ways in which we think about infrastructure in the city.
Right. In fact, there is also the right-based perspective, right to the city. Darshini ma'am at the start only said that there is this differentiation of infrastructure and services and the right-based approach.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
We as Indian are also, very famous that Indian standard for infrastructure. Also, we have service level benchmarks from many organizations, but our infrastructure worldwide kind of famous that we do not have any bottom. So that also, and we have to build that. So nevertheless, we will go to a way forward round and start with Kala ma'am to give 1 minute, way forward. And Kala
Yes,
ma'am
so
also had, yes, ma'am.
we have only 10 minutes left, so let's just 1 minute, 1.5 minutes from the panelists, please.
Panelists, yes.
Okay, very quickly. Darshini cut me off last time. I'll try to make up for this.
I'm sorry,
taking
but
an
I
extra
think we
minute.
time.
So what I was trying to ask is whether there is any systematic relationship between size of the city and the possibility of open defecation, Dr. Deljana. You talked only about Shanghai. whatever. I just wanted to know whether Xi'an will be the same, Chongqing will be the same, or Wuhan would be the same, right? That would be a very interesting relationship. So, in other words, you would like to understand whether open defecation is a micro level characteristic or a macro level phenomenon, city level or micro level, meaning what are the characteristics of individuals which systematically determine whether they engage in open defecation or not. Right, that is one other thing. And the final thing I wanted to say is that before Darshini cuts me off again, is that what are the institutional arrangements for provision of urban sanitation in China? See, in India, they're all very, very fragmented, right? We have the slum development board, and we have the national urban sanitation policy, and we have the state government doing something. We have a large number of private actors also. So even if you want to look at data on how many public toilets there are in Bangalore or Mumbai or Delhi or Chennai, we won't really get that information very easily without doing a lot of somersaults. So is that a similar problem in China, or is it a little bit easier or more messier? Thank you.
Dr. Yeah, way forward. Would you like to suggest something on this? Besides, I mean, you've already suggested the existence of large number of schemes, but a final 1 minute suggestion.
Yeah, just one sentence. I won't take much time. I think that if I was conducting such a study or I was engaged in such research, I would have also looked at the mechanisms that have been created by the agencies or the units of the government to facilitate or promote interaction between the citizens and the departments of the government. Because when you try and address such complex social issues, then an understanding of what the community's requirements are and what they are thinking about what would be convenient to them needs to be understood to take things forward. So that is the only thing that I wish to say. Thank you.
Yeah, Dr. Ambika Vishwanath.
Well, Dr. Rumi asked what I was going to ask about having a more community involvement. But I'm just going to add on to Professor Kala's question about, city size and how that makes a difference. And also if the presence of a nearby versus far away water source, do you think that also makes a difference when it comes to creating better sanitation networks? If that's something you wanted to look at as well.
Yes, Dr. Ziming, would you have any final word on this?
Oh, yes, I have. And I hope someday that we do horizontal comparisons, not just focusing on one city. Maybe we look at the different tiers of the city. For example, Shanghai is the first tier, and then we go to the central China, like Wuhan, and also to the west part of the China, and we will see quite different scenarios of the open defecation or sanitation problems. And then we go to the different communities, and some of them in the middle of the city and some is in the suburb. And then we will find the pressures of housing and look at the institutional factors behind the individual behaviors. And then we go to different countries, developing countries, not just China and India, but also the Eastern, the other part of Asia. And then we will see some similar pattern of the regime or some conflicts between the policies and the executions at the grassroots level. And then we do some theoretical contributions to this field, and then to draw some policy suggestions to every cities, and to see whether some policies based on these empirical studies would do better for the executions. This is how the scholars will do for the real world. And then this is the long-term plan for the scholars in this field. I think if we work together, then we will push this the whole problems, solutions to this problem forward. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'd like to give speaker the last word before I come in case you still want to respond, or would suggest
the speaker is the speaker cannot suggest a way forward, I'm afraid. But what I would like just to mention for Professor Kala. So we've been on this project for particularly the Shanghai part of it for about 2 years now. And for the last 2 years, we've been trying to determine who precisely is in charge of sanitation in Shanghai. And you would be surprised. And it is such a fragmented, multifaceted system with so many actors and so many agencies. And we're continuing our quest to find out where the central planning power sits. We're close, but at this point, I can't really say. So. Yeah, I think maybe this is where we should be headed to identify. Well, I don't know. It's all of that I'm trying to say. It is very, very complex, and there's such fragmentation and such complexity at place that there's a lot of work to be done in this particular field that we are all working in.
Thank you. I think we just have 3 minutes left, and I'll use 2 minutes of it. It's quite unfortunate that some of our original participants could not join due to some or the other reason. But this area of infrastructure versus services needs to be looked into. When we start, and it was a fascinating story that we heard today, just when a single aspect of one infrastructure was taken up, that is the sewerage system or access to sanitation. But within that also we're talking about the sewerage and the toilet access. But if we expand the inquiry to other infrastructures, including economic infrastructures, including transport access, housing, and the experience of deprivation, violence that comes on account of that. I think Dr. Rumi did mention about associated violence on account of displacements. It's a story of either peripheralization of low-income housing and pushing large communities into more vulnerable situation, and women tend to face. I must share a story with you that a friend of mine, and I think some of you would know, who's doing research, Karen Coelho. She was doing research in Chennai, and she came up with a story when we were looking at the peripheral settlements, that she said that the participants identified instances of rape in the sites, on the resettlement sites. And so some of the stories that come out of some of the resettlement sites, there's a huge experience of direct violence besides deprivations and structural violence on a consistent basis. But we also find, given the higher level of inequalities and social as well as economic inequalities in Indian city and the nature of Indian state, you do experience everyday violence. I think that's what Amita's study and our study found, that Indian cities have persistent, a low-key everyday violence. For example, women traveling in transport, you have there could be physical harassment, pawing, etc. But there is a constant tension of traveling and harassment, and it's a low-key everyday violence around access to water in the informal settlements, of women fighting with each other, violence by the private sector, contractors. Sometimes there's under kind of local landlords and goons and I think gangs and other things who are involved in provisioning of some of the basic services and the kind of violence that is experienced. So there's a whole big area which requires further investigation. And indeed, even if it was not COVID and you're not directly going into the area, these are difficult areas of research, and ethnographic methods are more helpful. And last point I want to say is that on some of the infrastructure access, the macro data, the city level data would tell you one story, but when you actually go onto the ground, you get a completely different story. I mean, that's what the pictures of China reveals, because if you look at China's statistical, the city statistical yearbooks and urban construction yearbooks and so on, you find a very different set of data. But then when you actually go onto the field, you see a very different set of data. And as Kala mentioned, in Indian context, the data is fragmented, it's not collected, and so on. We have a further more complication on interpreting the data. So all of you, thank you very much. Also thanks to the attendees and people who have raised questions. And thank you, Dr. Arjun Kumar, for organizing such interesting events during the lockdown and keeping us all invested in all the interesting discussions. So thank you all.
Ma'am, yes.
Yeah, would you like to come in, Dr. Arjun Kumar, and disclose this?
Yes, ma'am. I'll just take half a minute to thank all of you as a formal vote of thanks. So thank you everyone for attending this web policy talk on infrastructuring the city, trajectories of violence. And on behalf of Center for Habitat Urban Regional Studies, CHURS at IMPRI, we thank all of you for being a part of this very important deliberation. And we are thankful to our speaker, Dr. Deljana Iossifova, and joining from UK. Thank you so much, ma'am. And our chair, Professor Darshini Mahadevia, for a very prominent Indian scholar who is showing us the direction to go forward. In fact, I have learned most of my urban readings from Darshini ma'am's work. So, and I'm also very thankful to all the discussants, Professor Kala ma'am, Dr. Rumia Zaz sir, Dr. Ziming Lee, Ambika ma'am, and Professor Zufai and Samir sir could not join. But it would have been very pertinent. We'll try to also connect with our speaker if there is anything we can learn from everyone. There is some hailstorm or other things going on in Kolkata, so Soumyadev sir could not join. But we'll try to connect over the email and learn from each other. Thank you, everyone. Good night and have a nice day. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.